Okay, let's talk about OTCD conduct requirements. OTCD stands for over-the-counter derivatives. The Code of Conduct have some provisions regarding OTCD. It is to mitigate risk of dealing with over-the-counter derivatives business of a licensed corporation or various persons connected to the licensed corporations. Bear in mind, registered institutions are not required to abide by these Code of Conduct requirements. Okay? The scope of these OTCD conduct requirements is to mitigate risk of dealing with non-centrally cleared derivatives and to manage risk in relation to group affiliates and other connected persons. So these provisions in the Code of Conduct that aims to mitigate risk in OTCD transactions that are not centrally cleared are only applicable to non-centrally cleared OTCD. So if you trade an OTC derivative that is centrally cleared, you would not be subjected to these provisions. And these provisions are only applicable to licensed corporation. If the licensed corporation is a contracting party entering into an OTCD transaction, that means that the licensed corporation is trading on behalf of its own, not trading for a client. Or if a licensed corporation is licensed to do Type 9 activities, that is asset management, and they entered into an OTCD transaction for a CIS they manage. In those cases, they are also subjected to these provisions in the Code of Conduct that concerns non-centrally cleared OTCD transactions. So what are the requirements for risk mitigation for OTCD transactions? Basically, licensed corporations shall ensure that the trading relationship with counterparties are documented in writing before the trade. Material terms, basically the details of the trade, should be in writing. And also, it should document the valuation method of the OTCD in writing. That means that in order to do a trade, they should also document how this trade should be valued, how do we determine the winnings and losses with regards to the trade. And it should also assess how market conditions can impact the predetermined valuation method, whether market conditions can impact the valuation method. They should also assess whether it will happen. Management of risk of group affiliates and other connected persons with regards to OTCD. The thing about this provision is that the risk profile of the licensed corporation may be subjected to financial exposure it has with OTCD transaction of third parties. That means that if basically if a licensed corporation is dealing in OTCD derivatives for a connected party or for a group affiliate, and if the group affiliate is being impacted negatively, then there are some risk associated with the licensed corporation itself. And when dealing on behalf of group affiliates and other connected person, licensed corporation should apply the same standard of risk management as if it is dealing for himself or itself. The reason being that the impact of derivative to a group affiliate may negatively impact the licensed corporation itself. That's why you should apply the same set of standards, not any looser. So there are also special handling requirements of OTCD transactions of group affiliates and connected persons. Licensed persons that solicit, recommend, or arrange for OTCD transaction between a group affiliate and a client should always act in the best interest of the client that is not the group affiliate. Okay, give priority to the client. If there's a trade between a group affiliate and a client, always give priority to the client. Special disclosure of OTCD transaction of group affiliates and connected person. And if the dealing of the OTCD is arranged between a client and an unlicensed group affiliate, the licensed corporation should inform the client that such transaction is not subjected to regulatory oversight. You should make it very specific to the client that the counterparty they are dealing with is not subjected to regulatory oversight. Okay, next in line, we are going to talk about NCC OTCD margin requirements. NCC stands for non-centrally cleared. The primary objective of such requirements is to reduce systematic risk and also encourages central clearing. NCC OTCD margin requirements. Licensed corporation entering into NCC OTCD transaction should collect initial margin IM and variation margin VM from the counterparty. Basically, IM and VM are collected by the counterparty of the trade of an NCC OTCD transaction. The purpose of having IM and VM are to ensure that the impact of a default is minimized. That means we both put some collateral in the counterparty's pocket so that if I'm unable to pay, they can realize that margin payment or collateral being posted so that if I lose and he win or it win, at least there's some guaranteed that a certain portion of the trade is going to be on it. And if it's not, then at least they can forfeit the margin being posted. Scope of IM and VM requirement. Basically, initial margin and variation margin are only applicable to licensed corporations. It is not applicable to registered institutions, and it is applicable to all non-centrally cleared OTCD transactions. Okay? However, the transactions amount must be greater than the threshold in order for IM and VM requirements to be valid. And IM and VM requirements only covers NCC OTCD trades between covered entities. So what exactly are covered entities? It includes financial counterparties, basically financial institutions, non-financial counterparties, and entities specified by the HKMA. However, certain parties are specifically excluded from the definition of covered entity, such as sovereigns, public sector entities, multilateral development banks, so on and so forth. So only covers NCC OTCD trades between covered entities. So if a trade is between a covered entity and non-covered entities, in that case, it is not subjected to IM and VM requirements. So what are some NCC OTCD transactions that are not subjected to margin requirements? Basically, it includes some physically settled FX transactions, some commodities forward transactions, and certain excluded currency contracts. These are not subjected to margin requirements. Conditions not subjected to margin requirements includes if you have doubts towards the enforceability of a netting agreement in respect of IM or VM. So you believe that even if the counterparty posts some marginal collateral to you, that these marginal collateral are not easily acceptable, then you may be exempted and not subjected to margin requirements. And if the trades, the OTCD trades, NCC OTCD trades are between intragroup transactions, then these margin requirements are also not required. In another case, if the counterparty of the trades has conducted what they called a substituted compliance, that means that they have fulfilled margin requirements in another acceptable jurisdiction, then there's no need to redo this kind of margin requirements in Hong Kong if you have done so in an overseas accepted jurisdiction. And also, in a situation when a licensee is not facing any counterparty risk, that means that the trade is definitely going to be honored. There's no risk in dealing with this trade, then it is also not subjected to margin requirements. Last but not least, when the counterparty of a trade is a covered entity, it's a non-financial counterparty, and it has declared that the transaction of NCC OTCD transaction is for hedging purposes only. In this case, it is also not subjected to margin requirements. So this is a table that detailed NCC OTCD IM and VM requirements. So we have 4 cases. In case 1, the principal of the trade is a licensed corporation and the counterparty is a normal company. As mentioned before, IM and VM requirements are only applicable if both parties are covered entities. A normal company is not a covered entity. That's why margin requirements are not applicable at all. The second case is that it's a trade between a licensed corporation and a covered entity. It's definitely applicable in that case. The third and fourth case are both conducted by registered institution. It doesn't really matter who the counterparty is. Registered institution by itself is not subjected to IM and VM requirements. In this table, we will also investigate the relationship between IM/VM requirements and the threshold. So in these 4 cases, in the first case, it is a trade between a licensed corporation and a normal company. As we mentioned before, it doesn't really matter how big the trade is, how frequent the trade is. It's not between covered entities. It's between one covered entity and one that is not a covered entity. In that case, margin requirements are not applicable. And in the second case, it's between a licensed corporation, which is a covered entity, and another covered entity, and the threshold has been passed. In that case, it's applicable. And in the last case, registered institution, it doesn't really matter who the counterparty is. If it is a registered institution, IM and VM requirements are not applicable at all. So how should a licensed corporations handle margin being posted? First of all, they should calculate variation margin at least once per day. They must calculate the accurate number of margin they should post and they should receive. They should collect. And once there's a need to collect margin payments, they should collect variation margin as soon as reasonably practicable. And the exchange of margin payments should be calculated according to the procedure prescribed by the Code of Conduct. So the Code of Conduct prescribed the methods of how to calculate the margin payments. Licensee must also ensure that the margins are adequately safeguarded, and also ensure that the margin's enforceability must be ensured and adequately protected by the law. Margin should be segregated from client asset and other assets owned by the licensed corporation. So if you collected margin from another counterparty, you should segregate such margin payments from your regular account and also client accounts. You should try to segregate it, be it as independent as possible. Remember, initial margin collected cannot be utilized by repledging or other means unless there's written agreement from the counterparty that allows you to do so and agree with such practices. So what kind of assets are eligible as initial margin and variation margin? Cash, securities, and gold are all acceptable. However, they will be subjected to haircut under the Code of Conduct. So it will not be calculated fully. They will be subjected to a haircut. So next in line, we are going to talk about OTCD reporting requirements. Basically, it is governed by the SFO OTCD reporting rules. The SFO OTCD reporting rules is a subsidiary legislation. And if you violate it, then there's a possibility you go to jail. The HKMA specifies which OTCD are subjected to reporting requirements. Basically, it is applicable to all licensed corporations. And the scope is that if there's a trade and OTCD transactions that are entered into by the licensed corporation as a party of the trade, that means they are participating in this trade on their own. And also in OTCD transactions that are entered into by the affiliate of a licensed corporation in Hong Kong. With these two conditions, they should report such trades. OTCD reporting exemptions. Just like margin requirements, OTCD transactions that are entered into by the licensed corporations, if it does not cross the threshold, no report is necessary. Once such threshold has been crossed, exemptions will be lost permanently. That means once you reach the threshold, then you have to report all unfinished OTCD transactions that it has entered into as a counterparty. So how do we report OTCD transaction? You should always report within 2 business days, which is T+2, and all trades outstanding must report valuation of the transaction every single day. So you must report to the system the valuation of your unfinished transactions every day. Transactions must be carried out using LEI. LEI is basically a company ID number. Licensed corporations that are no longer exempted can enjoy a grace period, which means they are allowed to report later, but not too late. That is 3 months after the day that they have ceased to become exempted. On that day, you have 3 months. And to make a report via the system, it is necessary to become a member of the HKTR, the HKTR being a transaction database of these OTCD transactions. So what kind of details should you report? For example, the class of the product, the type of the product, the date of the transaction is entered into, the date the transactions become effective, the date the transaction matures, particulars of the counterparties, clearing information, references assigned to the transaction, particulars of the transaction, notional amount, currency, agreed price, rate, and settlement details. Reporting duties of affiliate of LC. If a licensed corporation is entering into a transactions on behalf of an affiliate, of a group affiliate, either the party, the affiliate, or the licensed corporation itself can report the prescribed details. Next in line, we are going to talk about record-keeping obligations. Specified OTCD transactions should be kept for at least 5 years after the termination or maturity date of the transaction. And demonstration of compliance of record-keeping obligation should be readily accessible. That means they can read it at any time. Centrally cleared obligation of OTCD transaction. It is governed by OTCD derivatives transactions, clearing and record-keeping obligations, and designation of central counterparty rules. Specified OTCD. Some specific OTCD transactions are subjected to mandatory clearing obligations. That means they must be centrally cleared. So what's the scope? The scope covers OTCD transactions between prescribed persons and OTCD transactions between prescribed persons and financial service providers. Once again, it must cross the threshold to be subjected to mandatory clearing obligations. If such threshold is not being crossed, then no mandatory clearing obligation at all. So which entities are subjected to mandatory clearing obligations? Prescribed persons. Once again, it must cross the threshold. What exactly are prescribed persons? AFIs basically means banks, approved money brokers, licensed corporations, other persons who are specified in the OTCD clearing rules. And what exactly are financial service providers? Basically, it's big companies in general. There's no threshold, and they are actively engaged in activities related to OTC derivatives transactions or OTC derivative products outside of Hong Kong. These entities are subjected to mandatory clearing obligations if they trade between each other. So what kind of products are subjected to clearing obligations? Fixed to floating IRS, floating to floating IRS, overnight index swaps. These are all products that are subjected to clearing obligations. That means they must be centrally cleared. Mandatory clearing obligations exemptions. Persons who have crossed the threshold are regarded as having crossed it at all times thereafter. Therefore, they must have this mandatory clearing obligation. However, if for a period of no less than 12 months, the position falls below the clearing threshold for a consecutive period of 12 months, they may submit an exit notice to their regulator to avoid being subjected to clearing obligation thereafter. And if they eventually cross that threshold again, then these mandatory clearing obligation arise once again. It's a cycle. Are overseas OTCD transactions subjected to OTCD mandatory clearing obligations? If transactions are centrally cleared in another designated jurisdiction through a designated CCP, CCP being centrally clearing party, they are not required to be cleared in Hong Kong. So there are some OTCD trades that are not subjected to mandatory clearing obligations. Trades between group and group affiliates are not subjected to mandatory clearing obligation if such affiliate has been recognized as satisfying the requirements to be treated as an exempted affiliate. And if such OTCD transactions is being centrally cleared in an accepted overseas jurisdiction, then there's no need to be centrally cleared in Hong Kong. And if trades are entered into by a third party pursuant to instructions on a multilateral basis for the purpose of reduction of counterparty risk, then in that case, such trades are not subjected to mandatory clearing obligations. So this is a table that details OTCD mandatory clearing obligations. In case 1, if it is a trade between a prescribed person and another prescribed person and the threshold has been crossed, then clearing obligation certainly is applicable. And in case 2, since the threshold is not being crossed, clearing obligations is not there at all. For case 3, it is between a prescribed person and a financial service provider and the threshold has been crossed, then there's clearly clearing obligation. And for case 4, it is between a prescribed person and financial service provider. However, the threshold is not being crossed. Therefore, there is no clearing obligation. And for case 5 and 6, since it is between a prescribed person and a regular company, it doesn't really matter whether the threshold is being crossed. Clearing obligations will not be applicable at all. So last but not least, where do you centrally cleared OTCD? You should clear with the central clearing partner, which is the OTC Clearing Hong Kong Limited, a subsidiary of the HKEX Group.
For inquiries regarding HKSI licensing examinations, you are welcome to contact our staff through the following methods. By website, www.OTCExam.com. By phone, 211096444. By email, info@OTCExam.com. By WhatsApp, 934720664.